Hey, well, it's Red May again. We surge onward with our 1 month vacation from capitalism, our teach-in, call it what you will. Tonight's discussion is called The Political Economy of COVID-19. Before we get to that, however, I would like to clue you in as to what's coming up for the next few days. Tomorrow at, oh my God, nobody... let's stop back here. I forgot to put the, well, we have Belabored at 6 p.m., 5 p.m., I believe, with Cal Winslow, Sarah Jaffe, and Michelle Chen. Belabored is the dissents podcast in labor journalism, and Cal's written a book called the Seattle General Strike of 1919, which of course is of great interest to everybody here and should be of interest to everyone. It's the last general strike in the United States. Earlier that day, we have at 1 p.m. something called Socialism in the Time of Sanders and Shelter in Place. Jeremy Gilbert from England is going to talk about his book, 21st Century Socialism. He'll have Olivia Catby-Smith, Sarah Mason, Nick Mitchell, and a bunch of other people talk with him about it. And then on Monday at 1 p.m., we have Communism or Neo-Feudalism, which is a reframing of Rosa's Socialism or Barbarism. That has Jody Dean. She's written a wonderful article posing these alternatives in the Los Angeles Review of Books. So Jody will be giving her sort of science fictional extrapolation of the tendencies inherent in the moment. And then Jason Reed, Eva Cherniewski, and myself, we will comment on them. So a lot of good stuff coming up. And we also need money to keep going. It's getting there. Some more came in today. We're at $3,200. We have a lot of money to go. So just go to www.redmayseattle.org if you like what we're doing. Click on donate or go to our YouTube channel. And there's a link down there which you can click on to get to donate. If you get to our YouTube channel, subscribe. We're close enough almost to have 1,000 subscribers, which will get us free CC captioning so that differently abled people will be able to watch our panels. Good. We'll leave it there and we'll go to the matter at hand. So the first thing I like to say is I'm very happy to welcome back an alumna of Red May from 2018, Radhika Desai, professor of political studies at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, and author of an excellent book called Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire. I'm waiting for that after U.S. hegemony moment to really sort of sink in big. I think
we're nearly there.
We're nearly there. Welcome back, Radhika. So the plan today is simply this. We're going to be a kind of a left-wing, one of those Washington TV shows where someone will sketch out the economy, which will be Radhika talking about the political economy of COVID-19. And then our other guests, I'm joined by Charles Mudede, who everyone, of course, knows as a columnist for The Stranger. He's a screenwriter of excellent films, Zoo and Police Beat, and the director of a new film called Thin Skin.
By the way, I just have to plug my film. You can watch it on the Stranger website right now. We're streaming it for $5 from 2000. Sorry, there we go.
Charles is also has an online column called Slog, which everyone should check into now and then. He did compare Red May to Ridley Scott's Alien, which I thought was wonderful. I mean, that must have got us some viewers, which we wouldn't have got anyway. Charles's parents, both of your parents were economists, right? Or just your father?
My father's an economist, my son is an economist, and my daughter's studying to become an economist.
Okay.
I was the only one who turned to literature.
Charles is the one who rented to the theater and so forth. We're also lucky to have S. Charushala, known to her friends and comrades like me as Charu. She's the professor of the School of Interdisciplinary, wait a second, I got to get that right, Interdisciplinary Studies at UW-Bothell, and she's a former editor of Rethinking Marxism. So welcome, Charu, welcome, Charles, welcome, Radhika. Let's just sit back in our chairs. And
before Radhika starts, interdisciplinary arts and sciences. I just want to make sure people understand that interdisciplinarity traverses everything.
School,
the humanities, arts and humanities, all the way to
schools of interdisciplinary arts and sciences. I've known her all these years. So here we go. Imagine we're all sitting around a table here, Washington round table, looking seriously at the economy in the future. And we invite our geopolitical economist, Radhika Desai, to give us a picture of what's happening now, what we could expect in the future.
Okay, well, thanks, Philip, and hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Yes, I'm glad that Philip brought up my book, Geopolitical Economy, because the title I've given to what I'm going to say is actually the political and geopolitical economy of the pandemic. I'm going to tell it like the story of a developing analysis, and so I'll sort of, make my points. They're all part of a coherent picture, but I'll sort of make them one by one, and then I look forward to a discussion. Philip said I should speak for about 30 or 40 minutes. I'll try to keep it closer to 30 because I think the best part is when we are all talking to one another and asking questions and so on. So the core of my analysis I developed in an article I wrote, and I'm going to put some of these links in here as I go along. An article I wrote on the 15th of May, that is just, sorry, the 15th of March, just at the weekend after the WHO had declared the pandemic and stock markets around the world had probably the worst week, like almost forever. And all asset markets were plunging. Not only were stock prices plunging, but even bonds that are generally considered to be safe assets, US Treasury markets were sinking. So everything was going crazy. And I thought, okay, what does all this mean? And so I penned this article, which I've given you the link here for. And the basic point I made in this article is that the pandemic is hitting the pandemic, as it was by then, was hitting Western capitalist economies at a time when they had already been radically weakened by 4 decades of neoliberalism. The crisis had weakened healthcare systems, and then the weakened healthcare system was essentially in a situation where the governments of neoliberal societies had to essentially try to save healthcare systems from the pandemic. Rather than the healthcare system saving us from the pandemic, we had to save the healthcare system from the pandemic. This is what a sorry state of affairs we were in. And that then radiated out, exposing the underlying weaknesses of neoliberal economies and exposing the radical deficit in state capacities and in political capacities around the world. So that was the basic thesis. And ironically enough, just the previous month, I had been asked by a local outfit here in Winnipeg to give them a talk, and they chose the title. They said, Radhika, come and give us a talk on does capitalism have a future? And so I said, fine, I'll do that. And I gave, my answer was a resounding no. That talk had been given just in the middle of February. So a month later, I'm writing this other article. But basically what I'm trying to say by recalling all this is that my analysis is sort of when the pandemic hit, all the years of analyzing various national economies, Western economies, developing economies, the world economy seemed to culminate into my assessment. So that's what I'm trying to give you. So now the 4 major, so in that article, I made 4 major points. I said there are 4 aspects to this problem. The first aspect is that, as I said, the pandemic has hit Western economies, which had been weakened by 4 decades of neoliberalism. Now, what was neoliberalism? just so you to recall, neoliberalism is basically the policy that says markets good, state bad, roll back the welfare state, weaken unions, the state should not spend too much money on social programs, etc., etc. So this package of policies, this was the route that Western societies decided to take out of a previous crisis, the growth slowdown that hit Western economies in the 1970s. Some of you may recall, if you're old enough, that the 1970s were an extremely fraught decade. Right versus left, nobody knew what to do. And there were major political contests, strikes all over the place, students revolting, feminists burning bras, all sorts of things were going on. And out of all this, the side that won was the side that said neoliberalism is the solution. Neoliberalism is going to revive Western economies. It's going to restore growth. We're going to lift the dead hand of the state away from the capitalists, and they will revive their animal spirits, and they will start investing, etc., etc. In reality, neoliberalism not only failed to revive capitalism, it actually exacerbated the underlying problem. The underlying problem was demand problem. There was a shortage of demand. Demand was not expanding fast enough. And neoliberalism, by essentially squeezing the incomes, both of Western workers and of third world countries, it actually exacerbated that problem. So all it did, its deregulationary thrust, only benefited the financial sector. So what we got was, rather than a revitalized productive economy, we got a financialized economy with rising inequality, rising debt, repeated financial crises. And then in the context of all this, the state essentially saying, we don't have to do anything to revive the economy. We're going to give this entire portfolio over to the central bankers, and they, with their wonderful monetary policies, are going to essentially make sure that our economies run as best as possible. So that's partly how a figure like Alan Greenspan became a sort of rock star personality. This old guy was called, the maestro who sort of conducted the orchestra of the American economy just perfectly, etc., etc. So the second point I then made is that actually, although since at least 87, when Alan Greenspan became the chairman of the Federal Reserve, since at least that time, the Federal Reserve has, and other central banks have essentially relied on monetary policy. And I'll explain that in a minute, what it is, relied on monetary policy to try to regulate the economy. Essentially, even what little it could do in the past, it cannot do so anymore. So monetary policy is simply the idea that central bankers are the best managers of economies, and the main policy instrument they have is raising and lowering interest rates and injecting more liquidity into the banking system, essentially by buying some of their less liquid assets and giving them good cash instead. So that was the idea, that somehow these policy instruments are all that's needed. The old idea that the state must act to make investments, to spend money on public consumption, public investment, etc., this had gone out the door for a very long time. The only kind of fiscal policy that states had throughout the neoliberal period was to cut taxes on the rich, especially because we were told that if they had more money, they would invest. Well, they never invested. All they did was they put more money in financial markets. So anyway, monetary policy cannot do it anymore because, interestingly, the underlying economy, which had been progressively weakened for 40 years, but for almost all of those 40 years had managed to carry the financial sector, which was getting ever bigger. Imagine like a skinny little donkey on which a very, very fat man is sitting, and he's getting fatter by the minute, right? So now the point had come when the poor skinny donkey could not carry this big fat man anymore. And so the underlying problem with it, so the donkey is the economy, the big fat man is the financial sector. You can't have that anymore. So the underlying crisis is now economic. Both supply side, the supply chains were breaking down. We had already seen the oil supply issue coming up even before the pandemic hit. Other people were pointing out that supply chains were getting, and this is not to do only with Trump's trade wars or anything. There were many such problems. The underlying problem was economic, and on top of that, Western governments essentially could not do anything else in the face of the pandemic but shut the economy down. They had to shut the economy down. There was no other way. The healthcare systems were too weak to do anything else, and they did not have the capacity to do anything like what China had done. I'll come to that in a minute. So the underlying crisis is economic. There are both demand problems and supply problems. Finance relies on skimming off the earnings of the productive economy, the real economy. And with the real economy in crisis, this was no longer possible. In fact, one of the very interesting things that happened, part of the reason why all sorts of markets were collapsing in the week before March the 15th, is precisely that now the real economy companies, the airline, the tourist industry, the whatever, the motor car industry, whatever, every part of the productive economy, which had hitherto made the most substantial and high quality deposits into the banking system, they were clawing back these deposits because they needed the money. They were short of cash. They were no longer giving their excess money to the banking system. They needed it back, and they needed more. And in this context, then the banks themselves, which had been required after the 2008 crisis to recapitalize themselves, to have better reserves, etc., they could not actually, they were themselves in crisis because they did not have enough reserves and enough equity and so on. So so in this context, supplying more liquidity was not going to work because there was no longer any financial solutions to the problems. What you needed to do is you needed to have, essentially fiscal solutions rather than monetary policy solutions, but that was not possible. The third point I made is that the productive economy, the skinny little donkey who had gotten skinnier and skinnier over the last 40 years, there were at least three aspects to this skinniness, this weakness of the productive economy. Number one, in search for the last cent of profit, these productive real economy companies had essentially stretched the productive system across the world. So, you essentially, for any given category of work, you try to get low-cost labor, etc. So supply chains were now stretched around the world. And very interestingly, this is something we've discovered in the context of the pandemic. Very little manufacturing actually goes on in Western countries, whether it is for drugs or for computers or whatever. We rely on cars, we rely on components that come to us from elsewhere. And so suddenly this became open. So the supply chains are stretched around the world in extremely taut fashion. Secondly, our economies were working on a just-in-time model. That means you don't keep any stocks. There is no fat to spare. You are essentially, you have just enough to get you through the 1 day or 1 week or whatever it is. And so there are hardly any inventories. There is really very little spare cash, etc. So this is another thing. So this just-in-time fragility was also there. And finally, of course, as I said before, neoliberalism never solved the demand problem. In fact, it made it worse because neoliberalism took incomes away from the people most likely to spend them and generate demand, from households, from states, from third world countries, etc. And they gave this income to people who are the least likely to spend it, the rich people, the 1%, perhaps the 10%, but certainly not the 90%. So in that sense, this low wage economy was also part of the problem. So that was the third point. And the fourth point is that I said that there is now also a crisis of crisis management. That is to say, hitherto, we had thought that we were going to rely on the state. Ultimately, when the invisible hand of the market shakes, the visible hand of the state comes and steadies the market. Well, 40 years of neoliberalism had reduced state capacities to such an extent that they were basically not capable of doing so. What we saw in China, conjuring up several hospitals within a short span of time, that kind of state capacity was not there. The kind of state capacity that allowed China to track infections back to their source, limit the contagion in one city, in one province, with very, very few outbreaks elsewhere. All of this was not possible for neoliberal economies. And so that was the state capacity, but there was also the underlying debilitation of political capacity. And for that, what you have to see is that how do you get a political system where idiots like Trump and Johnson can get elected? When you have such political systems, it means that there is something radically broken in your politics, and no government can do anything unless it can inspire trust and confidence. But neoliberalism has divided societies so much, undermined trust and confidence so much, that the established elites are being opposed by charlatans like Trump and Johnson. They got elected by saying we are going to go against what the established elite want us to do. And that's why they got elected. That's also a mark of course, the weakness of the left, because it should have been the left that had organized the discontents of neoliberalism. But as it turned out, it was the right of the worst kind, that the left's own movement, I'm not talking about you and I as Marxists, I'm talking about the social democratic parties, they kept moving further and further to the right, and essentially they became part of the neoliberal establishment. You could have conservative or Republican neoliberalism, or you could have social democratic or democratic liberalism, neoliberalism. You got two flavors of neoliberalism, but there was nothing else on offer. So of course people said, okay, if you don't want this, what do you do? What do you do? The left was not out there organizing them, so they went for Trump. There you go. Okay, so there is a crisis of crisis management, of low state capacity, low political capacity. And then what you got, and this is very interesting, it came out particularly in the debates in the UK, where initially Dominic Cummings, who is this extremely maverick advisor to Boris Johnson, actually seemed to say, well, we are going to pursue the herd immunity strategy. Now, think about this. Herd immunity is actually a term that comes out of the language of vaccination, that once you have vaccinated some 60, 70, 80% of a population, then essentially everybody else, the whole population is relatively safe because it is not possible for them to get infected. But now, what they were saying is that herd immunity was not an effect of vaccination. They were going to pursue herd immunity essentially by not doing anything, allowing whoever was going to be infected to get infected, let them die if they have to. I mean, this is practically genocidal. So, and then when there was an outcry about this, then the government immediately denied and said, oh, we are not pursuing herd immunity. That's not true at all, etc., etc. But of course, in reality, if you think about it, what is the strategy of flattening the curve? It is another type of herd immunity. What they are saying is, we are not doing anything to try to stop the virus in its tracks. We're not tracking, we're not isolating, we're not treating, etc. We are going to allow the virus to do its work, but we're going to slow down the pace at which it does it, so that what will happen is that our health systems will not get overwhelmed. As one very wonderful Dr. Alison Pollock, who has been a very important critic of the neoliberalization of the healthcare system in the UK, said, she said, all the time when I was growing up, I thought the NHS, the National Health Service, was going to protect me. Now I'm being asked to protect the National Health Service. What kind of a situation is this? So the crisis of crisis management had come to the point where governments were saying to their people, you're going to die, and we're going to do nothing about it, other than to save the national healthcare system. Okay, so those are the points I made in my piece at the beginning of in the middle of March. Then I had said at the very end of it that I was going to, so I said, there are some possibilities shaping up. The capitalist system is essentially on very, very shaky ground. Its foundations are creaking. This represents opportunities and responsibilities for the left. And I said, but that is the subject of another article. In the end, that article which I was writing turned out to be, could not not be contained in a 3,000-4,000 word format. It kept growing, became 12,000 words. And essentially what I'm now doing is I'm serializing its main part. So it has some 7 major parts. And now, without me taking too long, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what I'm going to say in there. So obviously, there is great political hope right now. It comes from a number of different factors. Number one, our states, including the Trump administration, the Johnson administration, some of the most neoliberal countries of the world, states are increasing their spending, getting out of the monetary policy straitjacket, actually taking expansive fiscal policy in order to support incomes, etc. during the lockdown. Many reforms are being proposed. Many establishment figures say reform is needed, the state is back, we can never go back to neoliberal capitalism ever again, globalization is finished. All of this is being talked about. People are rethinking priorities, at least those who are not in the bad position of wondering where the next meal is coming from, are saying, you know, do I really need to travel so much? Do I really need to consume so much? Isn't the quiet life so much better? Look at the air, it's fresher. I can see deer and rabbits in my garden, and isn't this all wonderful? And can't we not have that? So what is the good life about? And also, of course, people are realizing that actually reducing our economic activity and certainly our resource consumption can be good for the environment, and that is also adding more making more people realize that, you know, we can do something about climate change. People are realizing that such zoonotic viruses that leap onto human beings from animals to human beings, a lot of this leaping is happening in the context of factory farming, which has been criticized as inhuman, etc. So you know, radical ideas like a universal basic income and modern monetary theory, which says that there is should not be any serious constraint on state spending money for real productive purposes, like modern monetary theory, these ideas are being discussed, and news readership is very high. Practically everything I'm saying right now should probably be known to most people, because everybody is interested in what's going on, what is the next chapter, etc. So there are a lot of grounds for political hope. However, and this is, I feel, a very important point, we have to realize that realizing these hopes is not going to be easy, because the 40 years of neoliberalism have weakened the left. As I said, the left, instead of moving further to the left in response to the right moving further to the right, has actually simply followed the right and moved the left party's positions to the right as well. So the entire political spectrum has moved to the right, and this is a very bad position to be in. Moreover, we know from more than 150 years of history of capitalism acting against revolutionary currents of every imaginable sort that the right has a lot of resources. They are economic, they are financial, they are military, they are intelligence related, they are public relations related. All of these instruments are in the hands of the right, and this is something we have to be very aware of. And very interestingly, I feel that even the science has become highly politicized. I mean, again, in the UK, for example, you have the so-called SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Committee for the Government, which is advising the government, and its advice has been so political and so distrusted by their fellow scientists that there has been a competing independent SAGE group set up in order to give a different advice to the government. So, you know, in this context, trying to figure out what is to be done is not going to be easy. So that's another point. Now, I'll try and wrap up very soon. Well, no, I have about 10 minutes, I think. So, okay, so. Right. So there is a reason. We have to also understand why the pandemic has become such a deep political crisis. Because, you know, initially when the lockdown occurred and, you know, politicians could announce spending programs and we're going to give you so much money and we're going to support your incomes and blah, blah, and so on. Everybody thought this was great, and the support for governments were very high. But now that we are in the phase when the easing of restrictions is going to take place, in this context, it's going to become exceedingly political. It's going to become very political because people are going to say, what, you want me to go back to work? Some people have already, of course, throughout all this been working, but the non-essential workers who have to go back to work, they're going to say, well, what are you doing to protect me? What are you going to do if I fall ill? Why should I go to work if I can catch the virus and bring it back to my children and my family and so on and so forth? So all of this is going to become extremely political. So in this context, the reason why it has become a political crisis is because, think about it, when the Spanish flu occurred, the capitalism, there was no social contract. I mean, this was at the end of the First World War. There was no broad understanding that governments were responsible for the well-being and health of their people. Now we do have such an understanding. So even though we have neoliberal governments in power, they at least have to appear to be doing something. And that's what all of these lockdowns, etc., have been about. And of course, another thing we have to understand is that the pandemic is not something that has just hit capitalism from afar. The pandemic and this jumping of zoonotic viruses from animals to humans is part of the capitalist organization of agriculture, particularly animal husbandry. So in that sense, the pandemic is internal to capitalism. And of course, it's also internal to the fact that we have so much connectivity. People travel around the world and in large numbers. There are cruise ships and a mass tourism industry and so on. So all of this means that this pandemic is internal to capitalism. It's not an exogenous shock. Now, in this context, the neoliberal choice is herd immunity, in which the virus just runs rampant through the population, or flattening the curve sort of herd immunity. But that's all neoliberalism is offering. Even today, in the core capitalist countries, the apparatus of tracking, isolating, quarantining, etc., is simply non-existent. I don't know how these things are going to work out. We are just opening up now. Will there be a second peak, etc.? We are going to have to see. Because flattening the curve is just another name for herd immunity. Whereas in China, Vietnam, in the Indian state of Kerala, you have had a very different approach. It's not based on corporate medicine, with big hospitals and big equipment and so on, but on a social community-based strategy. And that's what you really need to stamp out the virus. And that zero transmission, which should be the aim, is not the aim of the strategy of any one of our countries. Okay, so that's another thing. And nobody's talking about zero transmission. Everywhere where there is social rather than corporate medicine, we have seen successes. We have seen successes in Cuba, even in Venezuela, which is racked by sanctions of the American administration. So, okay. Now, in the response that the neoliberal governments have made, again, we see, oh, well, they are using the state, they are engaging in fiscal policy. Isn't that amazing? There are U-turns everywhere you look. But actually, if you look closely, neoliberalism's paw prints are all over the government responses. Consider just a few things. Number one, of course, as I said, they are offering you herd immunity in disguise. Number two, the state is not capable of responding with the necessary drugs, the hospitals, the equipment, and the social approach that we need, because that would require state capacity. It would require confidence of the people. None of these exist in our neoliberal societies. When they are giving income support, they are giving loans, not grants. In an already heavily indebted economy across the world, this is only going to store up problems for later, because interest rates are not going to remain low for very long. So that's another problem. All the aid is channeled through employers. There is very little direct aid to the people. I know Americans got some sort of check from the federal government, but that's because Trump wants to get reelected. It would not have happened in a non-election year, or if Trump was in his second term. So another thing is that there are so many qualifications so that a lot of people who should qualify for this aid are actually not qualifying for this aid. Also, of course, as you know, as this was being discussed already in February and March, people with inside information have been profiting by manipulating stock markets and becoming richer as a result. Big Pharma is going to get loads and loads of money to develop drugs whose effectiveness we don't know anything about. What we are hearing is that it is not, possible that it may be that there will never be a vaccine, but we're not going to find that out until billions and trillions of dollars have been given to Big Pharma to develop such products. So there you go. And there is also the refusal to learn from China, Vietnam, etc. At best, they will pay a couple of compliments to South Korea or Taiwan, but otherwise, the real successes that have taken place in countries with genuine social approaches is simply not anywhere on the radar of these people. So in that sense, the response has actually been deeply neoliberal. And in fact, in one of my articles, I pointed out that this actually reminds me of a passage in one of Marx's writings, where he says, and I think I can find it here, and just tell you, Marx says that, hang on. Well, it doesn't matter, but he basically says that all social orders, even capitalism, needs to keep their slaves alive, their workers, which Marx calls their slaves alive. We're now in a situation where capitalism is incapable of doing even that, and that means that the ruling class is no longer fit to rule. And this criticism seriously applies to our neoliberal rulers at this point. Okay, and the other thing is that, and this is a very key point that I will emphasize once again at the end. What we are being told is that we have to choose between lives and livelihoods. This is not a choice. They are, you're saying, do you want to save your lives or you want to earn your living? How can this be a choice? But this is the choice that neoliberals, so lockdown or ease lockdown, this is the only choice that you have. So we have to refuse that choice. So basically, unless the left manages to organize rapidly and coherently, I would say that if the neoliberal elites, the establishment, which is now a cross-party establishment, remains in power, what we are going to see is a new version of neoliberalism. We use the word neoliberalism to refer to the entire 40 years since about 1980, but in reality, there have been different phases of it. So you've got a more or less pure form of neoliberalism of the Thatchers and the Reagans who said market good, state bad, etc. But already by the 1990s, you got a new social democratic neoliberalism which said, oh, globalization is an unstoppable force. It prevents us from spending too much money on welfare and high wages and so on. And so we would love to do lots of wonderful things for you, but we cannot do it. By the 2000s, you got the George W. Bush type of empire neoliberalism. So globalization neoliberalism was gone and you got empire neoliberalism. And finally, in the last decade, you got austerity neoliberalism. We have to consolidate government finances, no money, etc., etc. So since neoliberalism has taken at least 4 different forms, why can it not take a 5th form? What will be that 5th form? It will be what I'm going to call pseudo-philanthropic neoliberalism. And its elements will be the following. State expenditure will rise. It will allegedly rise in order to promote popular welfare, but in reality, all the schemes that will be undertaken will be channeled via corporations in some fashion. So they will involve giving corporations vast quantities of money to provide whatever it is, healthcare or transportation or whatever it may be to the people, but at the state's expense, which gives corporations guaranteed risk-free profits, while and of course the payment does not rely on vast demand because the states will create the demand for it. And so there was all this public-private partnership scams will go on. And essentially what will happen is the taxpayers will support big corporations, as in many ways they're already doing, but this will become the main form of this pseudo-philanthropic neoliberalism. I mean, Bill Gates is a good example of such pseudo-philanthropic neoliberalism. So in that sense, I would say socialism is the only solution now. We have to refuse the opposition between lives and livelihoods. There must be an immediate emphasis on the complete elimination of the virus while supporting threatened livelihoods, including through income, rent, debt, food, and shelter support. This is what the Chinese got when they were forced into quarantines and lockdowns, and that's what everybody should get. There has to be a transformation of the economy away from the neoliberal model that has landed us in this soup through transformation of the financial sector into public utility banking, including, above all, capital controls, which prevents money from leaving the country and going to those tax havens, etc., etc. There should be a nationalization of monopolies, beginning with natural monopolies such as utilities, transportation, communication, etc., etc. There should be a universal basic income, but with two amendments. Number one, direct provision, straightforward state provision of shelter. Housing is a very, very big thing, big ticket item. Shelter, basic food, transportation, education, healthcare, some basic recreational services. All of this would mean the guaranteeing that the productive economy is focused on real needs. And there should also be some requirement in return for a basic income to do some sort of work. I mean, you cannot have a no work requirement. We can come back to that in the question and answer session. And nationalization of all land and the prevention of all types of rentier incomes, whether they come from land ownership or financial asset ownership, etc., which will disappear anyway if we have public utility banking. And finally, and this is very important, part of the reason why the left is so weak, and I can elaborate on later, is because it is weak on imperialism. And the left must learn to accept that there will be a pluripolar world. Chavez used to call it not a multipolar world, but a pluripolar world. Why? Because there will be different countries practicing different systems. And we hope, of course, that they will all be socialisms of one sort or another, but you have to respect the sovereign right of peoples to determine their own livelihoods, because a lot of imperialism has gone on in the name of promoting democracy and so on and so forth. And many parts of the left, including many parts of the radical left, have gone along with this. And this is shameful. It has to go. And of course, we have to accept that there will be a geopolitical shift towards the power of China. I think China has come out looking the best. It has emerged as a model of the public health response. It has also emerged as economically more rational, resilient, because it runs a national economy, not a capitalist economy. This is the key. And while, of course, China is certainly between about 1995 and 2005, China was very much the driver of so-called globalization, etc. I don't like the term globalization, but anyway, China was the driver of all these supply chains and all that. Since that time, and particularly since 2008, it has become a much more domestically oriented economy. And it's, in a certain sense, we all need to become that, because what's the point of having, let me rephrase that. An export-oriented economy is one which doesn't give a farthing about how much money its own people make. In fact, the less they make, the better. A domestically oriented economy which needs to sell to its own people cares about how much money ordinary people make in that country. That's the kind of economy we need. So, and so China today is emerging in that sense as a model. It is aiding hundreds of other countries, and a new world order is emerging in which it will serve as a better model. It's not perfect, but we had better learn at least from the things it is doing right, and its role in international organizations will only increase. So that's what I want to say. I think you're muted, Philip.
Actually, what I said was thank you very much, Radhika. I have a few comments. Maybe I'll make my response and we'll go around in a circle to Charu and then to Charles, and then come back. Basically, I have two kind of expanded comments and points. The point about eroded state capacity and eroded political capacity after the last 40 years is incontestable. And it brings up the question that someone, in fact, has just asked, what are the origins of the social contract between a government and its people in terms of what is it responsible for the health of their population? And what kind of social contract do we live in now under neoliberalism? Is it the same sort of contract? Trump is betting at the moment that it isn't. Trump has given up even trying to solve or take responsibility for the problem, literally. You know, he's flooding the airway with lives. He's using the pandemic as a way of mobilizing things around masks and so forth. And he's kind of betting that the fact that I'm not dealing with this population, you know, solving the problem, is not going to hurt me in the end. It's something that you would think was crazy. But the truth is, we have to start off by saying, we don't know. We don't know what living with 40 years of neoliberalism has done to what people expect a government ought to do for them. Now, it's also possible that people just assumed that the government would look out for their health without looking at the fine details. Nobody was tracking that all the hospitals were forced by to cut down the number of extra beds they had by financial pressure and so forth, or that everything was outsourced to ways that we couldn't get it. So nobody even imagined this happening. And it might be that watching all that happen can be a kind of a come to Jesus moment about that, but it also could not be. I mean, we don't really know, is my point. But I want to get back to neoliberalism itself again, the idea, and to say that while I agree with your analysis, basically, almost in toto, the vocabulary I would use is somewhat different for the 40 years. I would make a distinction between supply side economics, monetarism, and neoliberalism. I think it's very important. All of them still coexist at the time. Like supply side economics is basically cutting taxes for the rich. On the erroneous theory, which is proved wrong time after time, that if somehow the rich get money, there will be more investment and everything will trickle down. It never does. It's obvious that money goes out of poor people's pockets for food and things right away, and the rich, it just stays and goes in unproductive places. But they like getting their taxes cut, so they keep peddling that crap, and it goes on. And of course, one of the first things that Trump or any Republican does. Monetarism, and this sort of is basically screwing around with the interest rates, and Friedman's claim somehow that if you could control the money supply, the public money supply, you know, you would basically wouldn't have inflation and all the other problems. One of the problems with it was it never acknowledged, as in the financial crisis we found out in 2008, that most of the money that's created is created by banks, private banks, which just flood this credit into the system, and then the Fed sort of has to follow and backstop them, you know, but had no control over it until they put in some sort of capital adequacy requirements, which are working a little better at this point. I think the neoliberalism side is competition all the way down. It's the idea that risk, embracing risk for everybody, is a healthy thing. You know, it's better, instead of having a pension fund, to have your money in the stock market because it could go up and so forth. And it really is a huge risk shift from the state to individuals who are now finding out, when there is no state capacity to deal with this incredible pandemic, how much of that risk is shifted onto themselves. But as people like Jason Reed have said at Red May during this period, the crazy thing about neoliberalism is that it's also an effective economy that almost goes from body to body. And it's not even an ideology, but it's the notion that, yes, I've screwed up and it's my own fault, it's my own responsibility, but tomorrow is the first day of the rest of my life, and it's entirely within my control that I turn it all around and become a success. And it's very, very hard. That is, you know, I mean, I guess that's another version of the American dream. And it's hard to, you know, one doesn't come with a structural analysis and say, the odds of you're doing that are 100,000 to 1. Nobody wants to hear that. They'd rather hear that they're free people who don't have to wear masks because I'm an American, you know. So you're dealing with this particular moment where we don't really know what people expect of the state. At the time when I grew up, everybody expected you'd have free public education in colleges. You know, now for some reason, you know, nobody's out there. I mean, obviously we on the left are raging about the insane levels of student debt, but there isn't a mass stampede in the way that one would think a population that had decided that that was part of the contract would be out there. So we're about to find out what the contract with the government is. So I'll end my comments there and sort of pass it on to Charu.
Hey everyone, as always, Radhika, your talks give us so much to think about, more than one can encompass and respond to in this short period. So I'm going to make 3 comments, which are not so much comments, well, they're comments, but also questions. One sort of framing point I want to make so you can see where the questions come from actually goes back to some earlier work that I did, my first book on structuralism and individualism in economic analysis. Don't buy it, it's stupid, it's old, and I've changed my mind on a lot of things, but it was actually written around another moment, which you have referred to as that sort of moment of structural adjustment, the rise of neoliberalism. And in that moment, one thing that I pointed out is there was a pendulum swing, right? There was the structuralist, developmentalist state. There was now going to be the neoliberal state. And I want to note that one of the reasons that I wrote that book, and not alone, I was among a bunch of people saying this, is that we were concerned that there was going to be a pendulum swing back. And so I want to start by noting that I was listening to you and I got the stuff about neoliberalism, but I want to ask about this imagination of the state. The state that I recollect was not a very good state. It was not a very happy state. Over here, I have a picture of Marx. The other picture is of Ambedkar, who reminds us that this state that preceded the neoliberal state was actually not that great in the third world. For people who were Dalits, for people who were OBC in India, in the US, the state, I do not think can claim to have been prior to neoliberalism particularly good for sort of marginalized communities. So one question I have has to do with what feels to me a little bit nostalgic about a state that never existed in terms of our imagination of what would happen in terms of recuperating the state. That's one. The second question might be of, you can do it or not, it's more of interest to nerdy people like me. It's not necessarily central. It has implications, but not necessarily central to your political points, which is the discussion about the difference between an underconsumption hypothesis and an overaccumulation hypothesis. It feels to me a lot of what you're describing seems to suggest that part of what's going on is underconsumption. And that leads to very different kinds of fiscal policy responses compared to what you slipped in, which didn't actually fit in with the rest of the political analysis that, okay, we could consume less and we're more, right? That I'm trying to think through what these two analyses would lead to in terms of political actions, whether done by the state or whether done elsewhere. I had a bunch more questions, but I think those two will suffice. Thank you. I think, Charles, it's up to you.
Charles? But you'll probably have to unmute yourself to do it.
There we are. There was a great talk, by the way, and there was a lot of stuff. I mean, I was making notes all over the place, and there are things that I caught that I had not anticipated, and that you were able to make to help me make connections in different directions that I needed, that I absolutely needed to make. So thank you so much for the talk. But there was just I just have 3 or maybe 4 things that I wanted to go through to think about. And one is just in a general sense. I'm always interested when we talk about, and this is not to do with your conclusions, but I'm always interested when we talk about Trump and people like Boris Johnson, and we sort of try to figure out what was the political background that enabled their success, right? And we often say that the left failed and they had switched to they'd gone too much to the right, with the Blairites and this kind of thing, right? And of course the Clintons and followed them. But I always have a problem with this, only because as a point of departure in thinking about Trump and also Boris Johnson, is that in the case of say in the United States, Black Americans are very religious often, and and also live in rural areas, and so forth and so on, but they don't vote for Trump. And so to me, I'm always trying to say, like, maybe it's more it's more complicated, but maybe we should always be like very, like, you know what I mean? Like, we should step through that a little more carefully to say, like, well, I mean, it's not that straightforward, because they're obviously appealing to something else rather than saying the left failed to provide all the goods. I agree that the left has had disappointments, but if you look at, I mean, as I said, if you look at other groups outside, particularly in the United States, or even if you could say, for example, I think Thomas Piketty was talking about these other new alliances that have formed, say, in France and in the UK, that were not similar political bloc alliances in the past, and they're much more, they're problematic, but they always say, like, wow, we got to, before we jump into thinking about Trump and how how he emerged, how he became president. There's clearly some of that. My second point, after following from that one, which is like you really brought this on, and I really was fascinated with your breakdown of neoliberalism into specific periods. And I was all the periods I agreed with. There was one that I just wanted to trouble a little bit, only because I think that you're correct to point out about I like this the pseudo philanthropy, because I live in Seattle and I've been trying to articulate that for a long, and I couldn't find the words for it. But I feel like that is if I'm correct, I feel, and you might not feel this way, but I feel that we're right now at a crossroad where two possibilities are involved. And I'm thinking of right now we have sort of this Brazilian model, right, where you have pure, like, the death of the economy will cause more death than the death of your life. I mean, this is what the president's saying to the public, and he's not even in the moment right now, as the corpses are just piling and so forth and so on. And so you have this other sort of, I call it sort of this necro economics direction, right, where they're just saying no matter what, death is not the solution. Death is not as important as the life of the economy. And but in a way, Bill Gates is not saying that. He's saying what you're saying. He's saying, what I mean? He wants to take over the philanthropy side and provide the sort of guidance, and the way you articulated was like a perfect match. But I felt like, is that a different direction is being proposed? Because Bill Gates may not be winning right now. What's winning possibly is the Brazilian model, as I call it, which was first expressed in Texas, and now it's become generalized. I mean, now we have governors saying that, without even fear. I mean, I think in April, when I think it was the lieutenant governor of Texas first made this, it was a scandal. But now it's common, and so I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, that's clearly a trajectory. It's one, but Bill Gates has been pumping, has been appearing on MSNBC and all of these things, trying to present this other model. Says we can actually, if you give it to us billionaires, we can solve this, and we will find the solutions. We'll give you the cures and so forth and so on. So I wanted, and my last point was. That just goes back a little bit. I always felt that there's the Economist. What his name? He's an Australian economist, and he came up with the term. I think it was Quiggin. Yeah, Quiggin is his name. And I've always felt that there was this moment. Why this sort of leads to that point of the pseudo. Philanthropy as opposed to necroeconomics, as I call it. There was this moment where there was this kind of abeyance, because so much of neoliberalism, particularly in the way that it was communicated or enforced throughout the third world, or the developing world, or whatever people call it, through structural adjustment programs and things like that. The whole notion was that this is what works. And, there was this whole thing about, you couldn't, you couldn't have infant industry development. You couldn't do all these sort of classical sort of like development programs that kind of worked. People like Ha-Joon Chang sort of went into this and discussed like how this was kind of baloney, because if you go back to Germany and so on and so on, if you find that that's how you become a rich capitalist state, is through these steps. But at that point, neoliberalism kind of made a successful argument that you have to liberalize your markets, and that's what that'll be how economies grow, how growth takes off, right? And so, but after 2008, a lot of countries, saw USA doing exactly what the IMF told them not to do, no matter what. On the threat of, like, you know what I mean, of real like economic pain, right? If you do not, and so suddenly they said, but USA did this. They bailed out their banks, right? They also were, there's a whole thing about giving. I forgot what the name is in development economics, but it's when you give out money to some industry so that they can sell their products cheaper overseas. And there's a whole I just can't. There's all these, but
it's subsidies. The word
subsidies,
is subsidies.
Yeah, subsidies. Yeah, and and so what. And the USA was doing all of this with its farmers and so on, and Bush doing it for the votes, and then this happened. And so then the question is, with the loss of justification for neoliberalism in 2008, with much of the world, what happened between 2008 and the present crash? I'm not sure I know you call it austerity, but I always thought austerity was always close to neoliberalism. It never really left. It was always, around and entered and exited, and never vanished. And Quiggin, the Australian, just called it zombie economics, meaning that there was economics, there was neoliberalism with no justification whatsoever. Like they could impose IMF kind of policies on Greece without actually saying why you have to do this, or whether it'll help the economy. I mean, everybody knew it wouldn't, and it didn't matter that it did or did not. The thing was, you could just do it because that's it. That's what we do, and we're not even going to attempt to throw roses at you, right? No more. You just have to do it. You have to pay back your debts and restructure your economy to meet these commitments and so on and so on. And so I was always interested that period which you mentioned. I was sort of I'm still trying to define. That's it. Those are my points.
I'll turn over to Radhika. Charles, it wasn't the Lieutenant Governor of Texas that said that first in April. Thomas Friedman wrote in the New York Times that the cure was worse than the disease. How's that for a significant moment? Radhika, would you?
Great. Yeah, sure. Wow, there are loads of questions, and I also see there are some more in the chat feed. So I'll try to do justice to them. Okay, so one set of questions are around the social contract, and so. And so what are the origins of the social contract? Well, the origins of the social contract actually lie in a period of the history of the world, not just of the West, but of the world, in which essentially you witnessed, for one reason or another, in different parts of the world, a relatively high level of political mobilization. Basically, I think of the entire period from 1914 to 1945 as a single period. Arno Meyer, the Princeton historian, calls it the 30 years crisis. And I think that's a very apt term for a number of reasons. Because the First World War is a sort of culmination of the crisis of the imperial and authoritarian societies. And then societies all over the world go through a real churning, through two world wars, a Great Depression, economic disconnection in between, a kind of global fracture, as one writer called it, which we are experiencing once again. All of these things are happening, and at the end of it, a world emerges which sees much more popular empowerment. So you have people organized for war in most Western countries or the imperialist countries. You have the revolutionary countries, whether it is Russia and Eastern Europe or China, etc. If you think about it, the 30 years crisis is sort of bookended by these two great revolutions, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, right? So 1917, 1945, roughly. And of course, because of their existence, nationalist movements also were, that was part of the success of nationalist movements being able to win decolonization. So there was nationalist mobilization for that. So in that context, that's why you get anything like a social contract. Obviously, it's not the same in every country. It's, for example, much weaker in the United States than it is in say Europe, in Britain, etc. So you have all these differences, but nevertheless something like this operates, and it's a period of popular empowerment, and that's why you have the social contract. Obviously, the other thing is that once you had the existence of communism, Western societies also had to adapt and say that, look, we are not cavalier about ordinary people, and we do care. And so a lot of people point out that if you look at the map of the world and you look at the big communist bloc, Russia, Eastern Europe, and then China, on either side of it, to the east of it, because of this communism, you got land reform. To the west of it, you got welfare states, because of the threat of communism. So I think that's all of these are important. I completely agree with Charu when she says that, of course, this was not a perfect time by a long shot. It's just that compared to what we got in the neoliberal context, it's much worse. Because, oddly enough, in neoliberalism, what we have witnessed is that on the left, we have had this flowering of, sort of anti-racism, feminism, all these good things, LGBTQ. But there is definitely a sense in which, because we are in a neoliberal period, these issues have only been addressed, as Nancy Fraser would say, in recognition terms, not in redistribution terms. So you can have a Black person becoming the president of the United States, but that does not change the lives of the vast majority of Black people in the United States, who in many ways can be worse off than they were before. And so that's something else that we have to bear in mind. So that's about the social contract. I think that you also, both Charles and Philip raised the issue of Trump and Bolsonaro and the Brazilian model. And I would say that there's a whole bunch of issues involved here. So if I don't address them all, please feel free to come back and make your own remarks, etc. But basically, I feel that in the United States, of course, the social contract itself was weaker. And so what you get in the, you get a much more sort of Bolsonaro type of politics. And yes, I mean, remember, okay, the way I think about it is as follows. In the United States, the political establishment, which is not Trump, is in favor of some more scientific, sensible policies, but of course, they always have a corporate inflection. The corporate inflection towards the pseudo-philanthropic neoliberalism that I'm talking about. The Trumps, the Bolsonaros, the Johnsons, they are the outsiders. And even Johnson, although he has been slightly tamed, that's why they came out with this flagrant announcement of, herd immunity as the strategy, etc., etc. So these people go out and say what the neoliberal establishment will dress up in some fancy hypocritical lies, but they are offering the same thing. So that's part of what's going on there. Now, the other thing is that essentially people like Bolsonaro, many of your state governors who want to open up right away, they are merely expressing the interests of ordinary small capitalists, in particular, the restaurateurs, the small manufacturers, the whatever, who are suffering for the lack of, they are losing their livelihoods. They're losing their livelihoods not because the virus requires it, but because neoliberalism has left Western governments with no better response. The Chinese are opening up their economy again, but this is not happening here. We have if you've looked at the death rates, my God, the Chinese have a per million death rate, like about 3 or 4 people per million of Chinese people died in China. In the United States, in continental Europe, in Britain, it's close to like between 1 and 300 per million have died. These statistics are horrific. They demonstrate the incompetence of our neoliberal regime. So I think that, and this whole, open up the economy, hunger will kill us, etc. This is precisely the choice that I'm saying we have to refuse. We cannot say there is a choice between saving lives and saving livelihoods. We want both. We have to have both. This is not a choice. We should not be asked to choose. There is, that's what we have to demand. That's what our governments are not capable of giving us, is lives and livelihoods. That's what we want. So that's part of my response to Trump and Bolsonaro. Neoliberalism, well, I mean, the way I look at it, Philip, neoliberalism consists of supply side economics, monetarism, competition, individual responsibility. All of these things are part of neoliberalism. To me, it's the umbrella term that contains all these other bits. So that's just how I look at it. But there's also a lot of debate about this, and some people say that only the people who dislike neoliberalism, only the critics of neoliberalism use the term neoliberalism. I'm not quite sure that that's necessarily true. I mean, it's true only insofar as the neoliberals themselves would just say, well, this is just sensible policy. We don't have to characterize it in any way. The couple of other things I should add about neoliberalism is that, it is always articulated in terms of markets good, states bad. In reality, it's never been really about markets or even about competition. It's actually been about corporate power. And that's partly why, as neoliberalism has advanced, initially, small business people, etc., were very much in favor of it. But today, you see very much a pitting of the interests of big corporations and small capitalists. And they are increasingly pitted against one another because Amazon, Walmart, they are all gaining against the small bookshops and the mom and pop stores and so on. And there is a real divide here. So it's about corporate power, not about markets. That's and I would say also that it emerged, interestingly enough, if you think about neoclassical economics as emerging in circa 1870 with the marginalist revolution, etc., etc., it emerged at a time when when capitalism was already moving away from the free competitive capitalism, if such there was, to much more monopoly capital, finance capital, etc., as was analyzed by Lenin and Hilferding and so on and so forth. So it is actually a product of that age. And there is actually a very good book by Quinn Slobodian, where he brings out this particular aspect of neoliberalism quite well. Right now, I'll go to some of Charu's points. I think I've addressed at least one of you. I mean, Charu, I totally agree that golden age era, the welfare state era, was definitely, it had its problems vis-a-vis women's rights, black rights, etc. And, I have read, I forget where, that in fact, if you, the kind of, in the United States, particularly, the kind of middle class life that people think everybody had was actually not shared by most black people, etc. And, it's also true that, for example, until the civil rights movement, black people didn't actually have the right to vote either. They could easily be prevented from voting by Jim Crow laws and all sorts of other such things. So I think that there were definitely huge problems, but compared to what came later, I mean, I think that model, the problems of that model should have been rectified rather than us going towards neoliberalism. That would be my view. Underconsumption versus overaccumulation. I've written a very, very long, I was looking at it the other day because somebody wanted to republish it. In 2010, I wrote this piece called Consumption Demand in Marx and in the Current Crisis. And as I say, it was almost 20,000 words already. So it's kind of like a little book rather than an article. But in it, I actually just throw out of the window, totally cavalierly, the distinction between the two. There is no distinction between the two. Underconsumption, that is less consumption, or overproduction are two sides of the same coin. There is too much productive capacity in relation to an existing level of demand. And I only complain about demand being constrained because basically needs are not satisfied, right? When you have large numbers of poor people in the world, there is need, and that need needs to be articulated into effective demand, and that will create great deal more production. So that will stimulate a lot more production. Where somebody else raised another point, I think it was in one of the chats, questions that came up that, what do you, I think it was your question, Charu. You said, so why are you then talking about people consuming less? Right? Well, I think that what is happening right now is, or what has happened over the course of neoliberalism, is that income disparity has increased. So a large part of the economy actually consists of selling more and more to people who already have a lot. So make them consume more than they need to, right? My favorite example, and please forgive me if there is anybody who thinks it's wrong, but it's just a way of illustrating my point. I mean, I don't remember before the 1990s or even 2000s, there being that many nail bars in the city where you kind of go and get your nails done, right? But it exists because people have to find a way of making a living, and all they can do is to try to get some of the income of those who already have incomes and draw them to themselves. So I think this sort of consumption, it has been excessive. And interestingly enough, it's precisely those sorts of consumptions that have in some ways been the worst affected. The airline industry, the mass tourism industry, the restaurants. I mean, it's not that there shouldn't be restaurants, but the proliferation of restaurants, is a mark of neoliberalism. One other way I like to put it is that in the 1980s, I first arrived in Canada in '84. Even then, so we had just gotten into neoliberalism. Even then, you could walk down a street and a student on a scholarship could still buy something in more or less every shop, sort of thing, if she wanted to. But more and more, what we have seen since then is the division of the retail sector into the really high-end sector where you can barely afford anything. A pair of jeans can cost $500, etc. And then the dollar shops where the working class people organize their consumption, right? So this kind of divide has taken place. And I think definitely there is a lot of unnecessary consumption that is going on among some sectors, and more of our economies are geared towards that. Well, when we come out from this lockdown and say, how are we going to organize economic life? We can say, well, do we need this kind of crappy mass tourism or etc.? What do we really need to consume? What are real needs, and what are kind of artificial needs, created by advertising and so on and so forth. So that's what I meant by that. I think, Charles, you had a question about, well, I think I answered your point about Trump and Johnson and what makes them succeed. And Black Americans who do not vote for Trump. I agree with you. I think that, look, I mean, Trump is such a darn racist, that one has to be really kind of, well, it would turn away a lot of Black people, right? He is out and out racist. He's a misogynist, all those things. However, I would say that Trump won the last election. Of course, I put it in quotation marks because Mrs. Clinton had a higher share of the vote, etc. But I also think it partly he won because what Mrs. Clinton was offering did not get enough of the underprivileged vote out to vote for her. So it's both an error of commission and omission. So very large numbers of white working class people did vote. They were energized by Trump and they went to vote, but the Black working class people, and quite frankly, even if they had elected Mrs. Clinton, we would have got an, fully, card carrying member of the war party coming to power. So you know what I mean by, they're basically a very aggressive international agenda. So that's part of my response to you, although of course I would love to hear what you think as well, why you think Trump was elected. Neoliberal periodization. I think this was about the Bolsonaro, Trump, Bill Gates, etc. And I think I sort of addressed that. And the last question then would be, what happened in the last 12 years? Well, the best way of answering that is that, again, when we use the word neoliberalism, we kind of, it implies that somehow the same set of arrangements has continued for 40 years, but it has not. Because it was an unstable, volatile arrangement, it has lurched from crisis to crisis, and it has always had to form and reform itself again and again. And it has done so using whatever opportunities it had. So in the last 12 years, basically what happened is, as you said, Charles, that the neoliberal state acted to bail out financial institutions. So private debt became socialized in many ways. And this was much more true of Europe, by the way, than it was here, because what happened in the United States actually is that bulk of the bailout was not organized by the state. The TARP and other such programs were minuscule compared to the money creation of the Federal Reserve. The quantitative easing of the Federal Reserve was a large part of the bailout. So there was that. But in European countries, particularly, austerity was very sharp, and basically they socialized the private debt, and then they said there's no money for anything else. So universities will suffer, schools will suffer, the health systems will suffer, public services will suffer, everything, cut. But when you cut that much, even what little demand there is begins collapsing. And of course, the other part, which we have hardly touched on, the other feature of the neoliberal period is that on the one hand, real wages are stagnating, in many cases declining, or they are only being held up because of that is held up at a certain level because people are taking more and more work, they're working more hours and so on, and they are going into debt. Whether it is for homes, for school fees, or whatever it is, car loans, whatever. So debt is expanding. Such a large part of household budgets was actually debt, right? Debt repayments. So all of that, so debt was supposed to support income, but actually it is draining income away. So all of that had to be resolved in some fashion, right? People were saying even before this pandemic hit that there was going to be a student debt crisis, another mortgage crisis, blah, blah, etc. All of these things were being expected, right? Stock market crisis, because of course the stock market had been rising since 2008. Like, on the basis, I think somebody asked me about this poor little sick donkey. That analogy just came to me as I was talking. But the poor little sick donkey is our economy. Sorry, if somebody can read me some of those questions, I can respond to those as well if you want, but because I've forgotten now where it is. But here it is. Somebody has said, when you account for the lack of demand in the neoliberal period, is this lack of demand from the consumer side of markets? How do you account for the overcapacity in global production? Or is overcapacity of productive forces only a relative effect of demand? I've already answered that. Basically, what is this is a very good question. That's why I wanted to go back to it. What is starving the sickly donkey? What is starving the sickly donkey is that the big guy all sitting on the donkey is getting fat by eating the donkey's food. Let's put it that way to take the analogy. Because essentially, the money that should be going into productive investment is not going into productive investment. It is simply going into financial investment, expanding the financial sector, and the amount of money looking for a return in the financial sector is expanding. But ultimately, that return can only come from the productive economy, whose relative size is shrinking compared to the financial economy. And that's what's starving the donkey. So I think I'll end there for now.
Okay, well, I think we should pursue that a little bit because it's interesting. And let's do it more conversationally here. Let's just go around the table quickly, short answers. So there's a lot of money that's sitting offshore that was made in the go-go 90s. And there are only a certain number of Picassos and sports teams to buy. It's got nowhere to go. A lot of it went into coastal real estate, like in Seattle, and so forth. Now, evidently, Blackstone has bought 1/3 share in warehouses around the country because it sees Amazon's making money. So you've got all this money that's saying, where's the return? That's overaccumulated. You've got 4 out of 5 small businesses that are going to go out of business, according to estimates. And you've got 1/4 of the people in the country who are unemployed and living on unemployment. Stock market that's being kept up artificially. How long can that go on? I mean, how do all these elements come together in your mind, Charu? And then maybe we'll go to Charles and then to Radhika.
So I'm going to address this, but I'm just reminded of a little meme somebody sent me on Facebook where there was this comment that said, everybody, all these businesses who supposedly made all the money because of their entrepreneurship are now all claiming because their workers are not there, they're going to go under. Maybe it's actually labor that creates the value. And then the meme is like a redoing of the sort of capital, which is, hey, bro, I told you so. I told you so. Critique of political economy, Marx and Engels. And the thing is, I do feel that what we are seeing is a real clarification of that. And so the 2 or 3 things I would say is that I think that part of what I want to draw on from a Marxist perspective in relation to our focus on finance, bringing it back to labor, is that from a Marxist perspective, I do feel it also should make us not only rethink the role of finance, but this is a conversation I've been having with Antonio Calari, it makes us rethink the distinction between productive and unproductive labor. I think it's become very clear that supply chains are part of productive labor. It's become very clear that some of the older ideas of what is productive, which was limited to a sort of heavy industrial manufacturing, and what is unproductive, which saw retail, supply chains, and so on, as not really productive, have to be shifted. Service industry were not seen as productive. So, but what if you looked at the necessary, unnecessary divide as reimagining what that is in terms of needs? Agricultural labor suddenly turns out to be more important. Car manufacturers, actually, even though we've always seen them as product, right? That is, if we focused only on surplus value, of course, I understand the distinction, but from a political perspective, I feel this current moment is giving us a really different way of thinking of that, and therefore also giving us a really different way of moving from a sort of old model of a factory industrial union, labor, politics, to a very different understanding of interconnected working production of things we need. In relation to that, there's also, and this, Radhika, is partly a response to the question of race of race, I mean, and caste. That's why I've got Ambedkar here. And the sort of, as Radhika picked up, the question of the state was really a question of what exactly, who was the state for? I do think that the Fraser distinction between identity, like recognition and exploitation, redistribution is heavily dependent purely on a very small segment of the gay rights question. I do not think that that is a good way to think of either some of the questions of gender or race. I think that particularly traditions of Black radicalism and Dalit radicalism and questions of economy in relation to that have really made it. And Fraser herself said that for certain kinds of marked labor, that might be different. I think that we start with, this is the second theoretical point, not just productive, unproductive, but somebody who I am very fond of reminding us was a core element of the Marxist scene here, Nancy Hartsock, who has passed away, who had such an influence on Marxist feminism and sort of conceptions of labor beyond a sort of standard Marxist narrative, pointed out to me once that if you think of the laboring body, abstract labor assumes that the laboring body is unmarked, that you can abstract away from its racial, gendered, other kinds of markers. And she pointed out that maybe care labor cannot be abstracted because it is always already. And I want to suggest that certain types of labor, when we make the Marxist move up abstraction, we erase race, and then we bring it back as recognition. I think that certain kinds of labor and certain kinds of economic activity are marked from the beginning. I'm reminded of a joke, one of my, I won't name her because she hasn't permitted me to do this. One of the jokes she gave me as a Dalit activist, she said, how many Brahmins does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer was, when have you last seen a Brahmin do manual labor, right? So the point is that you cannot do this separation and claim it to be recognition. I suspect that the failure of the welfare state is not accidental in relation to the fact that civil rights and other movements brought minorities and other people to make a claim on the social compact. I think what you are seeing in relation to what is called Europe's migration problem, which Iman Zain al-Abidin reminds us, makes us think it's a problem only when these people hit Europe's borders. We should consider it Africa's migration problem as opposed to Europe's, when we remember it is actually a global problem. It is again the racialization of the welfare state. So I think using the word state bypasses the fact that it is a nation state that we are talking about, and that the nation state form has always been racialized. And this brings me finally to the point Charles made, I think very politely, I'm now just going to say it. I don't think it is just that Blacks wouldn't vote for Trump because he's racist. I think apart from the failure of the left, what Trump gave people was racism. People, and we don't want to say this, but I'm going to say this, there is some point where we have to understand that the wages of whiteness was a thing, and that what Trump gave people was racism. It wasn't just incidental that it had a racial formation. And I think that is what I mean by the nostalgia of the nation state. How are you going to work through that to the welfare state? I agree that we do need to work through that. And I agree with your point that we can't just imagine we go back, that we have to actually think of a left, of making sure that this left is anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-casteist. And I think that just bracketing class off from these other dynamics won't let you get through to that point. And I do think that at least for Trump, I think for Modi in India, who was not included in your list, their selling point is their supremacy. It's a feature, not a bug. And that is something we as the left have to address, not just our corporatism, which we absolutely need to address. That's my comment.
Okay, Charles. 4 out of 5 businesses going out of business, stock market not going, all this capital going around. What are we looking at? Are we looking at philanthropic neoliberalism now? Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates taking the reins and saying, we've got to save capitalism now because no one else can do it but us. 25% unemployment, 4 out of 5 small businesses out. What do you think? Economic forecast.
You are muted, Charles.
Just give me. I've got three things to unpack. I know that being in Seattle, we're dealing with like, we have this billionaires and all that stuff. But I wanted just to bring up really, and this sort of comes back to a problem I've always had with the golden age of capitalism. Was one as a way to to understand what Trump means by make America great again. I'm gonna bring that out because it's like we have never examined this, I think, deep enough. And but what he says when he says make America great again, he is actually talking about that social democratic moment. That's what he's not really talking about the 19th century. Right, he's talking about the period between 1947 to 1970, right? And I've always felt that the social democratic moment has never really received its proper racial examination, be it in Sweden, in the Swedish model, which was almost used similar language to the Nazi form as well, except they just didn't turn to arms to fund it. And we've never really looked at the social democratic moment and said that it was that there was a profound connection between it and nationalism. We never really separated those two. And therefore, the crisis that we have right now with Trump really is a fruit of the social democratic moment in the fact that it was limited, be it in Europe, to just the European countries and excluded the others outside, be it in Africa, in Asia, and so forth and so on. But we have never really sat down and processed, like, what is, okay, sure, living standards, roads, and so on and so on. But I have great problems with that, and I think that some of the situation that the reaction to it, and okay, I want to just stop there. And then my second one was, there was something that you said that I really am fascinated with, and I'm going to close on this. You actually talked about we haven't really discussed this, but you had this section where you talked about the potential for change. That could come out of this, right? And I agree with this strongly. That there is actually there is a situation of emergency, right, for those in power, and we never really talk about. We always sort of mention things like, oh yeah, it's the economy. Oh yeah, they want to make more money. We always talk about this term, like, and I understand the metaphor of the horse and the donkey, but we always talk about it as if money is this numerical thing. The more you have more dollars and so on, and we never really get down to something like what if the fear is precisely people start to do other things? What if that is the greatest fear out there? It's not so much.
Could you explain that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, what is the greatest fear? And I'm sorry. I've been sort of I've been fingering my way through this dark, like, because I'm trying to, like, say, in a way, we've always had this sort of this monetary, like, explanation, right, for the doings of the rich, right? Right now, there's a story that came out that said that the billionaires made $400 billion under the pandemic, and it sounds like, oh, there's your explanation. That's what's going on here. They want to make more money and so forth and so on. And I think that we also get stuck in that same conclusion. But what if the real terror, what is the real situation and the real reason to open this, the real dilemma that they're having is not even really about money at all. It's really about what happens if, as you said, people start to notice the birds in their garden. What happens if you absolutely make a shift? And we also, because we often forget that the the introduction of capitalism, even in my country, in Zimbabwe, I always love reading about the introduction of capitalism because it's almost identical to the introduction of capitalism in Ireland. It's almost identical to the introduction of capitalism in the English rural areas, right? People were just tossed off their land. I mean, it was something that had to be engineered, right? It's something you had to do. And so we always forget that we are in an economy that had to be inculcated, right? That we had to get used to, right? And the real fear may not even actually be money. The real fear is, what if you have a huge population or a large group of people who suddenly are not, who are dispelled, right? Just like
I get it. Yeah,
that's what I mean. And I'm groping. I'm not there yet. I'm always trying to write this out, and I'm trying to read accordingly because I'm trying to get away from this. I'm trying to have a more qualitative explanation for capitalism, something along the sense of structure of feeling by, you know what I mean, like how, you know, this may be the real. And one last thing I'd say in that regard is, I was always impressed with Kalesky's point in his essay on full employment, right? Where he took seriously the issue was not so much that it made life better for the working classes if we did all these kinds of Keynesian kind of, right? The issue was issue of control. You know, the bosses were more worried about, you know what I mean? He actually took the political consequences seriously. And we often don't talk about the political consequences or the emotional consequences or the affective consequences of this experience and how it could really place the system in or compromise the system that's prevailed so far. That's all. That's it.
Well, I think you kind of are beginning to answer your own question, Charles. That last point, you know, what's the real fear? This is a brilliant point, and I agree with you. I think that you have to ask yourself, is all they want is the next billion or the next $1 trillion? It isn't. There is a deeper thing going on. What is that deeper thing? That deeper thing is they need to preserve capitalism, because what is capitalism for them? It is that they get to run everything.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the key. The introduction of capitalism, whether it's in Zimbabwe or Ireland or India, etc., it is ultimately about ruling other people. And capitalism is precisely about ruling other people. You know, think about it. In feudalism or in any other type of society, domination is open and naked, right? You give me rent or whatever it is, or else, etc. I will extraction. Here, in a certain sense, what happens is that the state privatizes a good part of its own power to capitalists. So instead of you working and giving over your money to the state, you have to work and give over your money to a certain capitalist, or give him the products that he will make money with, or services or whatever. Anyway, my point is that you are right. Ultimately, it's not just about making money, it's about preserving capitalism. And that capitalism is shaking. The foundations of that capitalism are shaking. And that is why they're going to scramble. Everything in politics is going to be about how to change things just so much as to keep them the way they were. That's what it's going to be about. And I'm not saying that their success is guaranteed. I don't think that, you know, Bill Gates had his own plans about what should happen, etc. But he may not succeed. And I also wonder, I mean, I think a lot of what I've been reading also suggests to me that at the moment, there are different types of capitalists within the United States in particular, who have slightly different interests. And it's not just the big and the small that I referred to earlier, but also I would say there are people like Bill Gates who seem to want to work with China, and others, Jeff Bezos or whoever, who don't. I mean, there are interesting divides. Also, there are some types of capital. All the airlines are going bust. But Jeff Bezos is making money hand over fist. So there will be winners and losers in this game as well. And you have to watch the pattern of the winning and the losing, etc., in order to understand what's going on and who will keep the power. Because it is about power ultimately, and so on. So that's my broad answer to your question. I just wanted to. I'm not sure
I'd like to jump in here for a second. I mean, I think that's a very important point. It's about keeping that industrial reserve army. They have to maintain control, but there's going to have to be a new way to do it because everything is so stretched out in terms of the old way. For example, you know, they need people to work at nursing homes in the cities, but they can't afford to live in the cities because everybody has essentially put all that overaccumulated capital into real estate. So you've got an insane real estate booms here. Everything, they've lost their political capacity to rule at the moment. Exactly. So they need a new dispensation of some, but you can see it as they start figuring out what kind of gifts do we give from Congress, because they're very careful not to give too much or not to give it in such a way that gives people freedom and independence from having to work or from having to take the job that comes to them.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, it's a guaranteed income, but it's not enough to get along. And by the way, it's going to be a replacement for Social Security. All of that stuff is going on. The one thing obviously people can't be handed is time. Because once people have their own time, you know, capital is all about owning your time and putting it to work.
Yes.
But we're at a moment where there isn't a model out there. You know, it's quite clear that the other one doesn't quite work. I mean, people were so stressed before the pandemic, but with this happening, with 25% unemployment, what are we going to do with all those people who are working and four out of five of those small businesses are going to stop working? You know,
yeah, I should respond to that because one of the reasons I've been asking us not to be nostalgic about the state and not to dismiss sort of questions of politics as pure identity has been something that has been noticed in large parts of the world. Now we call it the gig economy because, my God, if the same thing happens to white people, you can't use the same word. At one point, it used to be called the informal sector. But we need a new word for it because it's now in the first world. But if you look at the informal sector, what's interesting is that there is a point at which the reserve army grows so large that it is no longer reserve that you bring in and out. It is essentially a permanent underclass, which is there and which forms a sort of network of support, which allows wages to decline, but it is never, ever actually a place where labor is constantly drawn in a certain way. It becomes a permanent informal economy. And I think that racialization has meant that for a large part of first world minoritized communities, including the Black community, if you go back to Black Panthers and so on, they have had to be a reserve army that is not a reserve army like the white working class that collects unemployment and comes back and collects unemployment and comes back, right? It is like very different level of where they sit. And I think that it's not surprising, therefore, that if you look at something like the Solidarity Economies Network, if you look at places like the Kola Nut Collective, if you look at Chicago, if you look at Jackson, Mississippi, it's not entirely accidental that what is often written off as neoliberal self-help is also a form of radical vocabulary of anti-capitalist ownership of our own economic environment. So in terms of making people frightened of the loss of legitimacy of capitalism, one reason we do not want to write off this thing as just not really class, but recognition, is that maybe we fail to recognize the experiments of anti-capitalist economic activity that are emerging here. And I don't mean this in a neoliberal self-help sense, but I mean it in the sense of a very material practice that has to emerge when you have an entire ecosystem of people who are essentially a permanent reserve army and come at a certain point after a generation or two to realize that's what they're going to be. And then the informal sector becomes a permanent thing. Right, the gig economy is the emerging recognition that maybe your reserve relationship to tech or something else is essentially permanent, and certain kinds of new labor forms and alternate start. So that's another reason why I think re-racializing things like class, the reserve, the informal sector, the reserve economy can also help us really see a political direction that exceeds the sort of social democratic states in terms of what Charles was pointing out.
But
it's actually crucial.
Do you make a distinction between mutual aid and the service economy?
Yes, I do. I think that I would here really recommend the work of Carolyn Shanaz Hussain, who's written about the Black social economy. And she has another book on, they're called Roscas. And I'll have to look up the name of the book. But she does a really wonderful study that helps you look at the distinction between the kinds of rotating credit associations that work on radical principles, where she points out that things that were seen as failures, like Haiti, were actually much more radical and better, whereas some of the others, which were seen as success for productivist reasons, were not a success from radical perspectives, because the reason they succeeded productivistly is they had corporatist agendas. Jessica Nemhard has another book on radical politics and the distinction between neoliberal self-help and when and how they move from being self-help to articulating a very vocal anti-capitalist vision. So I think that's a distinction that really matters. Just as in Marxism, there's a distinction between corporate trade unions and radical shop floor unions, right? We really care about different types of unions. We don't think all unions are simply the same thing. I think we need to do the same when it comes to these other groups. These are distinctions that are crucial for the left to remember.
I think we should, if everybody has a final short statement, we should make it now, go round. Charles, do you have a few thoughts?
You have to unmute.
This is my thing. I just want to thank everybody, because there was when you brought up the informal sector to the gig economy, that was interesting to me, because I was always trying to I'm always looking to connect things that are sort of floating, and I can't find what it is. And there's a thing called System D. For years, I've been sort of trying to theorize it, which is like these informal markets in Nigeria and so on and so on. And it's so interesting that the gig economy is basically, and you're correct, the gig economy is System D. And and I said, okay, what is the pattern here? And I'm fascinated by this. The pattern is that a lot of the stuff is basically in the developing countries, as they're called, that they're remigrating to the West. And so you have System D. And then I'm also fascinated, and there was a second that was sort of fascinating to me, and this was sort of was brought up, was in terms of like pseudo philanthropy. And that sort of made another connection for me, which I have been sort of trying to deal with. And it was that the Bill Gates Foundation was this thing that was sort of directed at developing countries and providing aid and so forth and so on. And then you have it migrating back to the West again and setting up. And so you have this thing. And that was where I finally said, okay, so I finally got my three, because you always have to have three. And I was really pleased at the end of this conversation that we were talking together, that I finally said, okay, because I always knew that structural adjustment had been the way that that the IMF coordinated Western power in developing countries and so on. And then, of course, it came back in the form of Greece and other countries in Europe had to face austerity and all these same things, but they were all developed in the developing countries. And so I'm sort of fascinated by this trend of things returning back to the West. as after being having their experiment conducted on poor populations, and what that means for the future. And considering your talk and all these elements, that's what I'm walking away with. But thank you very much. That's all.
Thanks.
Oh.
Charu, why don't you go?
I already said a piece. So what I would say is that I really loved this talk. I think it reminded us, like I remain ambivalent about the nation state, but it reminded us that we really need solutions that cannot bypass the macro scale. And I think that while we we are having a discussion about the state, and I think Radhika is reminding us that, of course, we don't want the state that used to be, and we have to work through that. And I'm raising these issues about how do we work through that. But it's also a reminder that we need both the momentum from below, where it does require us to distinguish between neoliberal self-help and sort of radical grassroots organizing. But in the same way, we also perhaps, and I don't have it, but it's a really good reminder that we need it, is that just as I can make up the distinction in my mind between an NGO and a people's movement, I'd love it if we had something that wasn't just the social welfare state that emerged in that racialized form as the alternate to the kind of other state. What would our imagination on the macro scale be to make that distinction between different kinds of states? Because as Radhika pointed out, we need all those things, and we clearly need a macro state that can get us there. Yes.
Well, shall I go, Philip? Yeah. Okay. Well, I just want to close by taking up a couple of, because Charles and Charu had a lot of different questions, so I cannot answer them all, but I would like to mention a couple of things and then make a closing point. So the couple of things where Charu very correctly brought up the fact that I hadn't mentioned Modi. Now this is interesting. The Prime Minister, the fascist Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi. What's really interesting about him, however, is that he has not been a Bolsonaro. He has not railed against lockdown. And the reason for that is that he is like this, with really, really big corporate capital. He does not give, he doesn't care about the ordinary small businessmen, etc., on whom Bolsonaro's power is still based. Corporate India has got Modi elected time and again. Bill Gates has praised all of Modi's worst experiments, the stupidly organized, in fact, not stupid, the cruelly organized lockdown, demonetization, etc. So in that sense, Modi is different. And that's partly, since we were discussing the mad guys, I mean, this guy is not mad. He is actually, I mean, he is mad evil. All of them are mad evil, but he is more purely evil in many ways. So that was one point. I also love the point that Charu made about abstract labor and care labor not being abstracted. In fact, I think that in any demand we make, especially now that the whole world has become aware of how essential are essential workers, how badly they are paid, etc. All this awareness is being created, and I think that care work has to be the lever, one of the levers through which we organize the transformation, because the amount of unpaid work that goes on in our economies, or badly paid work, which is so essential, which is so critical, and I think that's something else we need to deal with. I also wanted to say, Charles, you brought up very beautifully and poignantly the point about the golden age and its limitations from a gender, race, etc. perspective, and that is that you said that MAGA really refers to that social democratic movement that I'm praising, and I certainly, I think I see what you mean, and in the United States context in particular, I think it has a particular resonance because that period was also the height of American power in many ways. And so in an international sense, America was powerful, and also partly because there was a relative restriction of immigration between circa 1914 or thereabouts until about 1970, America genuinely imagined itself as white, even though it was not. but it was able to get away with doing that. And I definitely think that all the things you've said about addressing those limitations of that vision are definitely true. But as Charu rightly guessed, I'm going to end by saying two things, and they center around the nation state. And it also refers to somebody asked me about my use of the term blank cosmopolitanism in one of my essays. And so basically, my point here is that the left loves to think of itself as internationalist. But what has happened in more recent times is that the internationalism, which still involves relations between nations, has been replaced by a cosmopolitanism, a pretense that nations don't even exist. Now, in my view, the nation state form is deeply connected with capitalism. Capitalism requires it, it creates it, and it also governs the dynamic of the relations between nation states. There is a lot more to be said about this, but I won't say it. But the basic point is that competition between countries and conflict between countries occur because of capitalism and its contradictions. Okay, so to me, the idea, the imagination of a world state, the unity of humanity, etc., cannot happen until we get out of capitalism. But in order to get there, we are going to have the nation state. Marx said every working class must settle affairs with its own bourgeoisie first. And the revolution is not going to happen in one loud thunderclap all over the world at once. Different countries will be farther ahead of other countries, and they will also make mistakes, and people will be mutual learning from mistakes will happen. But the revolution, the beginning of the revolution will take a national form. It will remain national perhaps for decades before anything else happens. So, and that is why the national level is critical. So that's one thing I want. And of course, it is the wet dream of capitalists that, you know, we have a very powerful nation state to back us, but nobody else should have a nation state. We are going to open up economies and penetrate them as we wish. That is their dream. No nation state should stand between us and the penetration of subordinated economies. That's what they want. And when the left parrots this rhetoric about cosmopolitanism and globalization and all that, they are walking straight into that trap. That's why so many leftists end up supporting these democracy campaigns and campaigns against brutal dictators and so on. So I think that's a very, very important point that we have to bear in mind, because and while I completely agree that there are all these solidarity economy type initiatives and so on, while I totally also agree that there can be a lot more decentralization, particularly with digital technology, that makes planning a whole lot easier. At some point, at some level, there has to be national coordination, at least as long as some powerful capitalist countries exist. When they no longer exist, we can talk about all sorts of wonderful things. But until they exist, you need that sort of organization. And that's partly why you also need parties. So while it's important to have these movements, and they will always create the vital, fundamental social basis of any serious radical politics, you also need a party to organize all the forces, take state power, etc. That's it. Oh, and I didn't answer your question, Philip, about how will all this financialization end? Well, it is already ending. Basically, it ends when it when it has killed the host. A parasite dies when it has killed the host. And finance is parasitical. And it has killed the host of the capitalist neoliberal economy.
Well, we will see what comes next. Meanwhile, beware of Bill Gates, a good warning for all of us here in Seattle. And of course, Bezos, who at various times people have suggested should take care of the housing, the transportation, and the education for the city. I want to turn it over to him as some sort of future solution.
Wow.
Wow. We shall see what will happen, and we might have to consult you again in 4 or 5 months when this thing starts to play out. We're walking into territory we don't really understand. This is kind of unprecedented in terms of, and we'll see what the capitalists invent for us, what kind of response we can come back. with. So thank you all very much, Charles, Charu.
Yeah. I just want to make, there's a point that was made about the virus in 1918 that I think we should just keep in mind, that, that you made, that was really important. That we all often talk about the two world wars and the market crash as being critical to the transformation of Western societies towards a kind of state interventionist model, right? And I've just never really considered until this conversation that the virus was there as well, and suddenly the issue of public health became critical. And so what's interesting right now is we're in a situation of comparable magnitude, and so there's a lot of there's hope that we can change and make better mistakes.
A good point to end on.
I would actually, no, I want us to end. I want to remind folks, we are in Seattle. We start in public, following Radhika's point, we started in sort of more public discourse with boycotts, which is the consumer, and people talk about boycotting Amazon. Tax Amazon now, nationalize them later.
Good point.
I like that. I like that. But before Amazon is nationalized and parts of it are turned over to Red May, we need your public support. So go to www.redmayseattle.org if you like what we've been presenting and would like us to keep doing more of it. Reach in your pocket, take out your credit card and donate. www.redmayseattle.org, or go down to YouTube and sign in on our, there's a link there. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel, because if we get 1,000 subscribers, we get free CC captioning, so we can make Red May available for the differently abled. So from all of us here, even though here is in various places, good night, or good afternoon if it's afternoon, or good morning if it's morning where you are. And we will see you again tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.